Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I'm Cesar Belloso. Today is August 25th, 4 p.m. I'd like to welcome you to Aapresid Congress from Pergamino. We're now having our presentation of Balancing Cycle and Soil Water, presentation by Dr. Beck. This presentation is part of the Gabriel Garnero Soil Symposium as part of Aapresid's 28th Congress. And it is nice to remember Gabriel at this symposium because it's part of the cycle where we will focus on the importance of the soil in the ecosystem as well as management practices to use the soil, focusing on health. Just like the Congress's slogan, Forever Alive, Forever Green, and the importance of soil as an engine for sustainability. I'm hearing some noise in the channel. I'm hearing noises. Thank you.
Aapresid 2020. I have been at Aapresid several times before and enjoyed very much coming to the conference, also visiting farms in the different areas of Argentina. The presentation today is going to address long-term planning and goals and where we have been in agriculture in the Western Hemisphere and probably worldwide, and where we really think we should be going, hopefully, in the future. My name is Dwayne Beck. I manage the Dakota Lakes Research Farm at Pierce, South Dakota for South Dakota State University and our group of farmers. Our website is dakotalakes.com. If you check us out on either YouTube or our website, you should be able to find a virtual field day that will show you a lot of the field work that's going on. Very good videos there and what we're trying to do with some of our research. Dakota Lakes is located in the central part of South Dakota in an area of semi-arid prairies or pampas, about halfway between Minneapolis and Denver. This is a typical look at the landscape. This is the farm. We have both irrigated and dry land parts. We're right adjacent to the Missouri River in South Dakota, and actually I'm located on some land that's not all that productive, but some of it is very good. This is a typical look at the landscape. It's not dissimilar from areas in the pampas of Argentina. We have trees only where there's major drainage ways because it's too dry to support tree growth. So it's not like the more humid areas in Argentina that will support trees. Dakota Lakes Research Farm is owned by farmers, both irrigation and dryland farmers. We've been 100% low disturbance no-till since inception in 1990. The production enterprise profits support the research to a certain extent. The relationship between Dakota Lakes Research Farm and Argentine farmers, Argentine agriculture began in the late 1990s with Ronnie Kuhlman and Cesar Belloso and Gustavo Oliverio. In some of these people that from the foundation, Conservando. So here are some photographs taken in the late 1990s. Some of them young men there have, like me, turned into older men, and we're still very, very good friends. So I can name almost all of these guys. I hopefully have lost a little weight from when this photograph was taken. The forces that led to the creation of Dakota Lakes Research Farm were probably set in motion centuries ago when mankind first started to intentionally produce food, fiber, and fuel instead of just harvesting. He was tempted to produce his own. Early farming systems were often polycultures, especially in the Western Hemisphere. Negative feedback loops occurred as the land degraded. If they did things wrong, the land degraded, and then normally they moved to new land, which worked well when they were semi-nomadic or nomadic. When civilizations became less mobile, they started to put in cities. There was increased demand on the land and more degradation right around the cities. Energy was a limiting factor. In all cases, all the energy they were using at that time was biological and came directly or indirectly from sunlight, either in form of wood or other biological products, or human effort or animal effort. The products produced by sunlight were used as food, feed, or fuel, using too much land for feed. For animal traction, for instance, reduced food supplies or fuel quantities. So it was always a balancing act amongst those needs in the traditional farming system. The Western Hemisphere had few animals suited for use in tillage and transportation until Europeans arrived. The horse was not here, the cow was not here, and so there were a few animals, but not the animals that were common in Europe. This impacted the type of farming systems used in the Western Hemisphere as compared to those used in Europe. Progress, in parentheses, was limited because there was not enough energy to both produce the food and transport it elsewhere for sale, or to increase your productivity beyond what the capability was. There was not enough food and fuel to build cities and fight wars, so empires like the Roman, Spanish, British, Inca, and Aztec began to expand their territory and use slaves to increase the food production. And this is very familiar to us in the United States. My wife Ruth and I traveled to France a few years ago, and everywhere we went, we had to visit a castle. And the castles were nice. They were representative of a huge input of resources in terms of trying to build a castle and having the food to feed all the people to do that. As a consequence, the land around all of these castles was severely degraded. And it was clear to see that they had overextended the soil in order to try to produce this progress. Global exploration and exploitation by Europeans was driven by the need to find more land to degrade. So they went to North America and South America and Australia and New Zealand. So we share that history with each other. The goal of European-style agriculture has always been to extract maximum amounts of wealth from the colonies, and this included gold, but it also included products like cotton and wheat and those kind of things, and beef. Transportation limitations reduced the ability to extract wealth until the Industrial Revolution in Europe. It was very hard to get things from these inland areas of the Western Hemisphere and get them to Europe and then distributed around Europe until they had the Industrial Revolution. Fossil fuel for making steel, coal for making steel, and then consequently railroads was the engine that drove the Industrial Revolution in the UK and allowed a whole bunch of things to happen beyond that. Producing 2.3 million tons of steel annually, like England did in the mid-1800s, would have required cutting a forest of 97,000 square miles every year in England. Well, that is more land than the total surface area of the UK. So obviously they could not have had that industrial revolution without mining the fossil resources of the country. Same thing happened in the United States. We were pretty well limited to the eastern seaboard until we start getting railroads and such, but as a consequence, they degraded the soils. And George Washington, who was our first president of the United States, and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton had conversations about the need to do a better job of managing the soils, or they would have to start expanding westward. And in fact, in 1803. Just a decade after that or less, the Louisiana Purchase occurred, where the middle part of what is now the United States was purchased from France. And explorers Lewis and Clark went up the Missouri River in 1804 to explore what they had purchased. This is a photograph taken from Dakota Lakes Research Farm at the Missouri River, where Lewis and Clark would have visited in 1804. This type of landscape would be similar to what they saw, other than the water would be, the river bottom there would be mostly trees and not filled with water. It's now a reservoir. You notice that the book Dirt, David Montgomery is speaking at this conference. He authored this book. This photograph, if I'm not wrong, from the cover was taken in South Dakota during the 1930s. So that means in less than 50 years after South Dakota became a state, 1889, and the occurrence of what we call the Dust Bowl was less than 50 years. And there was just barely 100 years from Lewis and Clark until when this happened. So the degradation happened very, very quickly. At the same time the dust was blowing, the Missouri River was flooding, which caused them to build the reservoirs, which you saw in the background of that photo. Obviously, the water, nutrient, and energy cycles of the native system were broken. Now, in the interim from the 1930s until the last decade or so, farm policy and farming techniques were developed that tried to reduce the damage that was being done, but they did not address the real problems of those cycles being broken. The focus was always on better yields and better use of inputs, and we actually participated in a lot of that research for a while. But that is still going on, where we just continue to see how we can extract things better. But the linear input-output system that had developed under colonization has not changed back to a circular, cyclic system that was there when it was native vegetation. What this really is trying to do the wrong thing better. When we try to do what a lot of agriculture research is right now, it's the wrong thing what we're trying to do. We're just trying to do it better. So we need to go back and try to start doing the right things. The success of Dakota Lakes Research Farm was not achieved because we set out to improve yields. Rather, the goal that we had was to better manage the ecosystem processes with the natural system that was here before we started as the model. The light bulb was not invented by incrementally making candles better. If you think about, and I don't know how that translates to Spanish, but if you think about that statement, it's very profound. So let's look at the ecosystem processes. We have the water cycle, we have energy flow, the mineral cycle, and then community dynamics or diversity, which we will address a little bit today, but the other three we will focus on quite profoundly. The water cycle, we need to ask, does the rain feed plants and recharge groundwater, or does it run off or depercolate it or cause erosion and water quality degradation? In the United States, we have a lot of water that goes into the oceans, and that also occurs in Argentina, where it goes out into the ocean and causes some water quality issues. If lakes or rivers appear where they were never found before, it means the water is not being used for maximum benefits. And I say this because I've seen this happen in the period of time from the 1990s until a year and a half ago that I have been visiting Argentina. If you don't see something every day, you notice the differences better. And I've noticed that difference in what's happened to the water cycle. No-till is not about lack of tillage, but about managing soil water, soil structure, soil biology, and carbon compounds in the soil. So we all are no-tilling, but are we doing these other things? That is the real question, because just not doing tillage is just the first step. You can't really manage an ecosystem if you're doing tillage, but once you stop doing tillage, then you have to start actively managing these other things. One of the big things is maintaining residue, or this full surface cover, this duff layer. You notice the macropores there. That's a very important part of what we do. We try to take the E out of ET, in other words, not have water leave the landscape by evaporation, because evaporation is a wasteful use of water. It should go through a plant. It should transpire. In order to make it go through a plant, we have to make it enter the soil, which we do with our macropores and how we manage things and our total lack of disturbance. And then we try to increase the water holding capacity by raising the organic matter content of the soil, so when we do have water infiltrate, the soil will actually hold more. Ecosystems harvest sunlight energy to drive all your other processes. Making maximum use of the sunlight to convert water into biological energy is what we're doing, and to do that you have to have plants there with roots that are using water. Removing products from the ecosystem reduces the energy available for the biology in the ecosystem. So taking off residue, or even taking off grain at times, is enough to really starve the rest of the ecosystem. Is the energy that you use in your farming operation or your business constant or finite? In other words, does it happen every day, or is it limited? Sunlight will come up every day, so it's constant. We can predict that. Is it benign or potentially damaging? Sunlight is benign unless you're a fair-skinned Northern European in a sunshiny place, then you have to cover up. But other than that, sunlight is not harmful, whereas the fossil fuels that we now use are finite and potentially damaging. And they're also external, so you have to buy them, whereas the sunlight, if you control the land, the sunlight will come up and be there for you. 80% of the total input costs in agriculture can be traced directly to energy at the present time. The average wheat price in 1970 was 5 cents American per kilogram. The average price of a liter of crude oil was 2 cents per liter. If you compare those two, the price of wheat is not much higher, and the price of oil is much, much higher. We're using something that's going up in price to produce something that's going down in price. It doesn't make any sense. Fossil fuel input in agriculture 120 years ago was essentially zero. In 120 years, it will have to be zero again, because we won't have the fossil fuels. We have to find something else to meet those needs or change our farming operations. The Dakota Lakes Research Farm has a goal of being fossil fuel neutral by 2026. Part of this is by pressing our own oilseed crops, canola, linseed, soybeans, and sunflower. We're going to produce enough energy to replace all energy associated with production and transportation of the crop, including that needed to make the machinery and whatever that we use. This will be done without mining the soil of nutrients, organic matter, and productivity, or adversely impacting the environment. Now, the way most people farm today, we're doing all of these things in terms of removing nutrients and organic matter and impacting the environment. So we're not only going to produce our own energy, but we're going to not cause these other problems. If we press oil from our soybeans and export the oil, we have exported only carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. Nature will bring those back to us. If we export the meal, then the nutrients leave. What we're doing is trying to address the problem instead of treating the symptom. A lot of what we've done in the past is treating the symptoms, the soil degradation things, and we would build in North America terraces, for instance. This is a photograph of terraces in a field in South Dakota. It doesn't really stop the the runoff, it just minimizes it moving out of the field. Soil degradation is a symptom. It's not something to treat, it's a symptom. Indifference, ignorance, greed, and hubris are the causes, and tillage is one of the tools. So we allow soil degradation to happen because we think it's okay, but it's not okay. I've learned more from observing nature than trying to change it. Humans are always trying to change nature instead of learning how to understand it. Mother Nature has been managing ecosystems better and for longer than anyone else. What does she do? She harvests the maximum amount of sunlight. Left to her own, she will supply harvesters to take every bit of sunlight that falls on the earth and put it to good use. And she leaks very few nutrients, including carbon dioxide. If we're losing our organic matter, it's that we're leaking our carbon dioxide away. And she's not leaking those nutrients, she's recycling all of them. She makes maximum use of water and nutrients by having webs of mycorrhizal fungi and other tricks, but a lot of microbiological activity. She uses animals, big ones and little ones, as part of the system. Are the nutrients available for plant use and environmental services? This is mineral cycling or nutrient cycling. What's happening to your nutrients? Or have they been leached, eroded, or transported from the landscape, sent to China or to the ocean, or closer to the ocean, which is a problem in the U.S.? Ecosystems that leak nutrients turn into deserts. And so when you start looking at where deserts have occurred, often they talk about them as being at one time very productive areas. A 120-car train of soybeans contains 200,000 kilograms of phosphate. And we ship those out of the United States on a massive basis. They don't need to leave in a train or in a boat. They can also leave in the water. They don't have to even leave the country, and they get to a place where they can cause problems. So if we're not managing our water and nutrient cycle, then we do not have that available for use in the future. Reduction in pH, organic matter, and fertility are all symptoms of poor nutrient water cycle management. So if you have those problems, don't do the linear thing and put things on there. Learn how to cycle the stuff that you have. Weeds and diseases are nature's way of adding diversity to a system which lacks diversity. The best way to address that is to counter it by adding beneficial diversity to the system. Within all textural groups, as organic matter increased from 1 to 3%, available water holding capacity approximately doubled. This is that area of building organic matter to increase the water holding capacity of the soil, to make it more productive. When organic matter content increased to 4%, it then accounted for more than 60% of the total water holding capacity. On one of my first trips to Argentina, I was taken to this field by Cesar and Gustavo. And it had been in a rotation that was 7 years of pastures and then 7 years of farming with corn, wheat, and soybean in the mix, along with black oat as a cover crop. I was incredibly impressed, not only with what it looked like, but with what the soil looked like. My friend Ron Elverson, that some of you may remember, held some of that soil up for me to take this photograph. And this was, I think, in 1996. When I went back in 2006 to the same field, we had noticed a substantial difference in structure. This is what we see often in parts of the United States as well, when we do not have enough carbon in the system. The farming system had been switched from this one with perennial sequences in there and lots of high carbon compounds to one that was mostly soybeans and no perennial sequence. Organic matter in the pampa and in the prairies are both come from the grasses that occupied the landscape before we were there. We have to try to emulate in some manner the amount of organic matter that's there and the deepness of the roots. I took this photo when my daughters were very young. They're very much older than this now, so don't tell them I used this photo. But this is a native prairie plant in the northern Great Plains. This photo was taken in Afghanistan shortly after the war began in 9/11 type thing. And we had a friend of ours that was trying to no-till in Afghanistan, and this is what he encountered. He could not make no-till work simply because he had no organic matter and he had no surface residue. The surface residue, including the root systems, had been removed but when they harvested the wheat crop. This used to be the Hindu Kush, which was a very productive area of the world at one time. And this material was hauled from the fields and into the buildings. But notice that there just is almost no soil left on which to farm. We in the Western Hemisphere could end up in this situation if we continue doing what we are doing. Mother Nature uses animals, big ones and small ones. One of the secrets is going to be learning to cycle our residue and using animals as part of what we do. We cover forage crops in between our longer season crops like corn and soybeans or wheat. We'll put in a forage crop. And in our system, we swath these like this. This is put into a windrow. It stays over the winter because we have a cold, dry winter, so that works for us. We don't have to haul it to the building. Our cattle have legs, as Caesar would say, and we can go back out and harvest this with the livestock. And we use our irrigators where we have them to actually move the fences. And the cattle will eat those swaths during the cold time of year when there's nothing that grows because it's too cold. And we cycle our nutrients right back to the surface where it came from, and this will be seeded to corn in the next year, so that nutrients are there. The only way to produce human edible protein on marginal land is to use a ruminant animal. We're going to need more ruminant animals to produce the protein we need, and they're going to need to be done, in my opinion, not in feedlots, but out on the land. So 40 million more cows, more goats, and more sheep. We also need to use perennial sequences, so to put perennial crops in like used to be done in Argentina, and that allows us to use the livestock as well. Threats from climate change and ecosystem degradation require for us to take a totally different direction than what we've been taking for the last century and a half. Agriculture cannot do this alone. It needs all of society to have this brain transplant to change the way we look at things. Hopefully the politicians in both the northern and southern part of the Western Hemisphere will start to catch on. Ecosystem degradation, as I said before, is a symptom. Indifference, greed, jealousy, selfishness, ignorance, hubris are all the causes, and we need to get past that and start focusing like a laser on what we're doing. Bureaucracies, governments, and corporations are operated by people with limited tenure or short-term goals, and this is the main reason we have a problem, is these short-term goals that are only 2 or 3 years. And we do that ourselves often in our farming operations instead of really looking long time down the road. The goal of bureaucracies has always been to extract maximum amounts of wealth from the colonies and the colonists. Those doing the extraction now include multinational corporations. So we're not only being held hostage by governments, we're being held hostage by people we buy things from or sell things to. And they write the agenda, and we need to be writing that agenda ourselves. This extraction includes the youth that leave the countryside or the country. In North America, we have a lot of our young people leave and go to the cities or the more populated areas. And in Argentina, you even have people leave Argentina and come to the US or someplace else for more opportunity because we haven't really developed our agriculture to produce those opportunities. We've developed our agriculture to export stuff to somebody, and we think that is a win. Society and landowners and farmers deserve to have long-term research with long-term goals. At Dakota Lakes, we try to use 600 years. If we continue to do what we're doing now, what would it look like in 600 years? That's very difficult to do, but it's very enlightening to try to do that. If we look forward 600 years, the climate will change. We know that. But we will still be a continental climate, as will a lot of you on the Pampas. You'll be impacted by the mountains, and so you'll be in the continental part of the climate, meaning you have dry, cool, dry winters, in our case, cold, dry winters, and you'll have warm summers and moisture in the spring. That will change how you do things some if it becomes warmer, but the degradation of the ecosystem that has been going on now for 100 years will be potentially have a lot more negative impact than the change in the climate. If you do both of those things, then you really have a bad problem. Doing the right thing environmentally is almost always the correct economic approach in the long run. If you think about that, we always think about economics, but nobody truly looks at the long-term damage being done by us not managing the ecosystem better. Because if we mess up the water cycle, then the rivers start to flood and we have all this downstream damage and all those things that we should not have if we did a better job. The best time to make this transformational change, have this brain transplant, was 600 years ago. The second best time is now, and we may not have another chance. Thank you. I look forward to attending in person in the future, and I'll be available to take questions if you wish.
Bueno, gracias por la presentación, Dwayne. Voy a hacer una pequeña disculpa.
Thank you for your presentation, Dwayne. We had a technical problem and we couldn't introduce Dr. Beck. He is research manager in the Dakota Lakes Research Farm. He's the president of the University of Plant Science. He was graduated in 1975 and he received a degree in PhD degree in 1983. They are developing no-till systems in the central part of U.S. The main achievements have to do with the development of programs that allowed farmers to implement no-till tools in a profitable manner. After apologizing for not making this introduction, please start sending your questions. I have the first question for Dr. Dwayne Beck about this huge step that you suggest of not using fossil fuels in 2026 in your research farm. Do you think that agricultural industries are prepared, are ready for this?
Could you repeat that, Cesar?
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear the translation? Dr. Wayne, Dr. Beck, Yes, hello. Can you hear the translation? Can you
Yes.
can you hear me? Can you hear the translator?
Push the button in English because probably you are in the Spanish session.
Yeah, I am, but I can't find the button, Cesar.
In the
And
button
I
of
help.
the screen, beside the reaction, you have to share screen, to record,
Ah, claro.
Okay.
the language.
Maybe you have to translate for me, Caesar. I don't see it. I just chat.
Siguen el canal. Okay. I make you the question.
Okay.
If you have the goal to go to zero fossil fuel in 2026,
Yes.
what is your opinion about the machinery factories about this idea and how these factories can adapt to your proposal?
Well, the machinery is relatively easy because we can use vegetable oils in diesel machines. A hectare of canola will produce probably 240 liters of oil. And you have the meal that remains for you to use for feed. So all you're really taking is the carbon dioxide, water, and energy, and you're using that in your tractors. It's not dissimilar from when our forefathers came and used animals to do the work. So, did you hear that?
Yes, I hear. I don't know if they can, you can find the bottom. No.
Well, I have a share screen, but I don't have a language.
Okay.
Do you see it, Cody?
Okay. We go ahead with my bad English, but
You're doing
the
very
important
well.
thing that the translator translate correctly your English. Next question, Dwayne. If knowledge is a basic input in no-till system, what is your opinion about the universities today in the aspects that helps to professionals to the farms?
I think the universities can have a very definite role. As they function right now, we probably are not giving the students enough practical knowledge with experience on the farm. There's lots of students now, and we have several students that have no farm background, which does not negate them from being able to learn about agriculture. But I think we do need to do something that gets them, excuse me, out on the land more to learn. But the universities have a role to play because they're the knowledge. They just need to be convinced that to maybe research some things differently. I have no idea where that button is.
Yes, right. But okay. But
Okay.
in Dakota Lakes, there are an interaction between university farmers in the territory. Why that area is difficult to find an agronomist or people who can have this holistic view?
Well, most people, it's human nature, Cesar. Most people will prefer to take a pill versus exercise. And it's a similar thing. Many of the things that make us short-term profits are these quick fix inputs, and the long-term differences that we see requires long-term research, and that's the thing we've provided, where there's very little of that in the United States because there's no money there. The money is in selling the product. Now we got too many.
Okay, now I change to the cover crops. You are using cover crops planting at the same time of the cash crops at the same time?
No,
or intercropping? What experience you can,
we're
can
mostly
share with
not
us?
intercropping. We do have one field where we are intercropping with lucerne and maize, but we mostly are not doing that. We are mostly doing sequential cover crops. Mainly that's because if you start doing very complex mixed cropping, it's really hard to manage that in terms of diseases and weeds, and we're not quite ready for that, I don't think.
Okay, you have visited Argentina several times, and in your experience, what were you think are the challenge to reduce the gaps in the main crops in Argentina, the yield gaps in the main crops?
Well, diversity in the rotation, if you're looking just strictly at yields, but diversity in the rotation is one thing that's kind of lacking now that was there years ago, and especially when you had the perennial sequence. And the thing is to focus on your present crops is probably not the right answer, because those are mostly export crops. And if you're going to cycle things, you're going to have to find a different approach, as are we. And this is a very big leap, but we've been, like I said, doing the wrong thing for a long time. And we need to rethink how we're doing stuff.
Right, Dwayne, when you visit Argentina in 2009, you have the beginning of our chakra in Pergamino regional group. You make that question, what you are doing after this corn, this stubble corn, we are in May, and our answer to your question was, well, in next November, we plant soybeans. And you say, why? You are losing 6 months or 5 months without any crop with this good environment. And can you give a little summary of the impacts of the system that you propose in South Dakota, that you have an environment quite more hard and difficult to manage compared to our system?
Well, the thing is, instead of focusing on yield and short-term things, what we're focusing on being the best we can be at harvesting sunlight, the best we can be at cycling nutrients and building the soils and those kind of things. And if once you do that, then you start to get the gains in the yields of the crops that you are growing for grain. And Cody and I were discussing that during my presentation, where it was relatively easy for us in this specific area, because it is a tough environment, to show positive response to not doing tillage. Whereas in the areas that are more benevolent, it's more difficult. But in time, like David Brandt, you'll start to rebuild those soils, and then you start seeing the benefits. Whereas now you've actually, in the last 20 years, probably degraded the soils substantially.
But why you have an harder condition or harder environment conditionals is the spread of the no-till system in the Corn Belt is lower compared to the Dakota area.
Yeah, it's not as obvious the advantage of the no-till in the Corn Belt, unless you could do it for a number of years, and then you would see that difference in soil. So just saving water in the Corn Belt where you get excess rainfall anyway, it isn't an obvious win. It's something that's a little longer term, but they also haven't changed their rotation. So if we would have, where they grew one crop of wheat every 2 years here, if we would have continued with that type of rotation, the no-till wouldn't have worked either. We had to do both things to change the whole system in terms of changing the crops that we grew and the sequences we grew them in and how we did that to better manage the water. That was the idea. And then we became much more productive than if we wouldn't have changed everything all at one time, it'd have been more difficult.
But in the same way, in the Corn Belt, it's easier to have a better crop rotations and with the better result compared with the Dakotas, and is in that case a culture issue to change, because
well, and it's partially a government issue because we have the subsidized crop insurance that tends to favor doing those type of rotations there. And so it's a cultural issue because the farmer has to get a loan in order to farm, and in order to get a loan he needs to have the crop insurance, and they'll insure corn and soybeans, but they wouldn't insure chickpeas or peas or something that you hadn't grown before.
And in this way, you can imagine the farming without people in the future in the farm.
I don't think you can ever farm without people. I mean, people talk about the robots, and I think the robots can do things for us, but it's like precision agriculture. My grandfather, when he farmed, and he did tillage, unfortunately, with a horse, but it took him all day to plow an acre. Or my father, who hand harvested corn, it took him all day to harvest one small wagon load of corn. They had an integral knowledge of every square centimeter of their soils. And what we should do with precision agriculture is to develop that knowledge. And machines are not good at making decisions. They're good at remembering things, but not good at making decisions. A good friend of mine by the name of Cesar told me one time that in the old days, they treated every corn plant as an individual. So that's really what we should be doing with our machines.
Okay, Dwayne, thank you very much. I apologize about all the technical problems we have during your conference. We appreciate a lot, again, your participation in our conference. We think that you are one of the biggest brains in no-till system in the world, and it's a big honor to have you again here. And I send you from Aapresid and all the people you know in Argentina a big hug and regards to your family. Thank you very much, Dwayne.
Thank you, Cesar. It was great to be here again.